Hello everyone, this is Mateusz Kołosowski, and this time I'm going to talk about the power of exchange. This is how I titled this video series, and we're going to basically cover the importance of trading pieces properly, situations when it's really important to know which piece to keep on the board, which piece to trade off, which to exchange, in order to get a better position than your opponent. One of my favorite world champions, if not the most favorite one, Jose Raul Capablanca, said once that chess is a very simple game. You just need to know which piece to place on which square and which piece to trade off. Even though, of course, it's a huge simplification, and it's quite funny to say that chess is a simple game, whereas it is actually quite difficult. But there is something very true in this statement, that you just need to know where to put your pieces. Of course, there's just so many possibilities that in most of the situations we don't know where to put our pieces. And the second part of that statement, you need to know which pieces to trade off and which to keep on the board. This is actually the easier part, I think, although in practice you'll very often find out that this may also pose you some problems. And in this video series I would like to show you at least a few examples and give you a few guidelines perhaps on how to define your goals in the positions in your game, and also how to find out which pieces should be traded off and which of them should be kept. In the first game, I'm going to show you how Karpov perfectly recognized the requirements of the position, and even though he was very passive throughout most of the game, eventually he managed to get a very promising endgame, and as it was always in Karpov's case, he managed to squeeze out the full point out of seemingly equal position. So the first game is going to be Lyubomir Lyuboyevich and Anatoly Karpov from Linares, 1981, a very famous game, or at least I think so, and a game that I do believe you should be familiar with. So e4 c6, Karpov used this opening, the Caro-Kann defense, as his primary weapon to deal with e4 players, and even though c6 is not really a regular guest at the top level tournaments, it's so solid that for strategical players, for those who prefer positional chess, it can certainly be played at any sort of a level, and Karpov is the best example of that. d4, d5, knight c3, d takes e4, knight takes e4, bishop f5. This is most definitely the most popular line of the Caro-Kann defense. Knight g3, bishop g6, knight f3, knight d7. This is of course all theory. h4, h6, h5, bishop h7, bishop d3, bishop d3, queen d3, e6. Here Lyuboyevich went for bishop f4, and it's well known that it doesn't really make that much of a difference, because after bishop f4, black always gives a check on a5, and generally black's plan is to castle queenside. So if he wants to castle queenside, he needs to get rid of this pressure on the a2 pawn, so it's more or less necessary to go back with the bishop to d2, after which black plays queen c7. So if we look at this position, Lyuboyevich could have played bishop d2 in the first place, and then I could bet most of my money on Karpov replying with queen c7. Bishop f4, queen a5, bishop d2, queen c7 just transposes, queenside castle, and knight gf6. This is all theory, of course, and great many games have been played in this position. Basically, the whole point of the opening is that white is perhaps slightly better, or at least it's slightly more pleasant to play with white, as white has more space. Also, he has a slight lead in development, but as you will see in a moment, black just needs 2 moves to complete developing his pieces. He just needs to play bishop d6 or bishop e7, depending on what happens on the board, and most probably queenside castle. Of course, it's also possible to play bishop d6 and kingside castle, but Karpov was never famous for sharp tactical battle. He was always considered to be a great strategical player who understands chess like no one else. So queenside castle and playing with the kings on the same part of the board definitely suited him more than going for a double-edged position with opposite castles. So in this position, as I said, white is perhaps having a slightly more pleasant position, but at the same time black is extremely solid. It's difficult to find out where white can even plan to do something active, to do something aggressive, where to attack, which pieces to improve. And at the same time black just wants to castle queenside, as I said, develop the bishop, and at some point play c5, most probably maybe e5, or just consolidate and see what white is going to do. So Lyubojevich played knight e4 in this position, which would normally not be advised, and here's the first guideline. If you have more space, you should avoid exchanging pieces, but here Lyubojevich made the right call in my opinion, since the knight on g3 is not doing much in this position. As you can see, it cannot really go forward. Knight e2 does not seem to be so promising, at least in my opinion, even though it does support f4 square, but apart from that I don't see any good perspective for the knight placed on e2. It also blocks the e file, and white may consider playing rook h to e1 at some point, so knight e2 is not really what white wants to do. So knight e4 was played, and even though Lyubojevich has more space, he decided to trade off this pair of knight. And also we need to know that in Caro-Kann e5 is a very important square, so actually a line going like knight e4, queen e4, knight f6 may not be so promising for black, as the knight on d7 protects the e5 square. So if the knight from d7 goes to f6, white may be able to use the e5 square in the upcoming future. So knight e4, queenside castle, and here a very typical g3 move. White just wants to play bishop f4, dominate on dark squares. If he played knight f6, with the clear intention of putting the knight on e5 at some point, black could simply reply with g takes f6. This is perhaps a slightly controversial strategy, but at the same time, if black manages to trade off the dark squared bishops somehow, so that the pawn on h6 is not going to be a target, then perhaps the control over g file and potentially the ability to play f5 or even play f5 bishop g7 straight away may give black very reasonable chances. So instead of simplifying the position, white went g3, and here, as I said, black needs to deal with his development. Bishop e7 is not so promising, because then white may just play bishop f4 and at some point at least consider playing knight d6 check and dominate on dark squares. Black doesn't really want to take on e4 and then play queen e4, knight f6 because then e5 square is going to be very weak. But at the same time, he should do something about his pieces. He should exchange them because he has less space. So when you have less space, you either need to find more space, which in this case is not really possible, or trade off the pieces so that you have you don't have as much space as your opponent perhaps, but at the same time you don't need so much space because you don't have the amount of pieces that would fill that sort of space anyway. So Karpov wanted to trade off these knights, perhaps the knight on e4 and not necessarily the knight on f6, but as you can see here, both of the knights are highlighted in red, so one of the knights is going to be exchanged. And actually Karpov realized the subtlety of this position, and instead of going for the most straightforward knight takes e4, he found a very nicely looking resource, which is knight c5. Now black takes advantage of the fact that the pawn on d4 is pinned, so knight c5, bishop c5 is pretty much the only continuation, and black has managed to develop the bishop. Of course it's under attack, but at the same time it would not stand on c5 anyway, so black is just fine with moving it to either to d6, perhaps even to e7. And the small problem of space is solved, at least for the time being. Coming back to the previous position, instead of knight c5, as I said, black could have tried knight e4, but then queen e4. Knight f6 should be avoided, and I explained that. So bishop d6 looks like an alternative, but there was a game played in this position in the same year, so I'm pretty sure both of the players could have been familiar with it. It was played between Kudryashov and Kharitonov. So there was c4, knight f6, queen e2, black played c5, which is generally the thematic idea, bishop c3, c takes, knight takes d4, a6, and let's just say that after knight b3, queen c6, and a very strong rook h4, preparing the transfer of the rook to d4, and also protecting the pawn on c4. White obtained a very promising advantage, positional advantage of course, and later on went on to win. It's worth mentioning that here the more usual way of doubling up along d file with rook d4 would lose instantly due to queen h1 check, just winning the rook. So knight c5 was played, take, queen c4. 3 years later there was a game played with c4 by Tal and Miles. No, it could have been played later. It must have been played. I mean, it could have been played later. It must have been played earlier. But there was a game played with c4, and black replied bishop b6, bishop c3, rook h1, king b1, a6, queen c2, and once again the bishop on b6 is probably a bit misplaced. White may play knight e5 at some point, and once again, as it happens quite often in Caro-Kann, due to the space advantage, white had the upper hand. So coming back to the game, after the exchange of the knights, white played queen c4, bishop d6 of course, queen a4, king b8, and here Lyubovich went knight e5, which is a very strong move because now the knight is placed on this very strong e5 square, and basically the whole idea is connected with trying to exchange the bishop on d6, which is quite an important piece, for the knight on e5, and this idea has a tactical justification because, of course, after bishop takes e5, d takes e5, we see that the bishop is better piece than the knight on f6, because as you perhaps know, bishops are better than the knights in open positions, but also in the positions where the pawns are placed on both parts of the board. So here, since there are pawns on queenside and kingside, we could say that the bishop is slightly better. Also, it's connected with the fact that knights are stronger than the bishops when they have clear support and then when they cannot be driven away. Here the knight is a bit loose, and even though it can go to d5, it can always be challenged with a move like c4. Knight d7 is of course a passive move. So due to the fact that queen takes e5 runs into bishop f4, winning the queen, black cannot go for this position simply. So knight e5 was met with knight d5. It was quite interesting to play knight d7, because after knight f7 there is knight b6, so it's easy to go wrong for white and drop a piece. But still, white can just play f4, and after knight b6 the position is, I think, double-sided, with both players having some chances. Basically, if black manages to take on e5 under favorable circumstances, leaving himself with a theoretically weaker knight, but at the same time, now that the pawn is on f4, the bishop on d2 is slightly limited, so it makes a difference. If black manages to do that under favorable circumstances, he may get quite a promising position. So after knight e5, there was knight d5, as I said, f4. This already changes the situation a bit, because now the bishop on d2 is perhaps not a bad bishop yet, but it will become more passive comparing to the previous situation. So objectively, it was, from a strategical point of view at least, it was better to play rook h2 e1 and not to close the bishop on d2. Perhaps it was also possible to play knight c4, but I'm not sure what happens after b5. Of course, white still has queen b3, but perhaps this is a bit risky for white. There is also a very simple idea of knight b6, where black can exchange the knights and just simplify the position and potentially get some sort of equality. After knight d5 f4, black played knight b6, queen b3, and now, as I predicted, well, of course I knew the game, but this was basically Karpov's plan to exchange the bishop for the knight in a good situation. D takes e5, and we see that those three pawns are placed on dark squares, so they do limit the bishop on d2, and here Karpov, of course, here Karpov recognized this as a promising situation. Basically, you also need to know that such an exchange for the bishop versus a knight, where one of the players gets a knight, generally tends to favor, of course, apart from those objective situations when the bishop is better or the knight is better, such exchanges tend to favor the player who has a better chess understanding. And very often stronger players just prefer to create some sort of an imbalance, even though that from a strategical viewpoint it's a risky strategy, but they just strongly believe in their superiority comparing to their opponents, that they just go for a slightly inferior position, hoping to outplay the opponent in a strategical position. And of course, Karpov was a stronger player against Lyuboyevich, but of course the difference between them was not as huge that we could say that Karpov understood chess so much better than Ljubojevich, but you will see how the former world champion, managed to outplay his opponent relatively easy in such a position. So first he played knight d5, and this provoked c4, which is already a slight weakening of the d file, even though it looks very logical to expand, to get more space, to try to dominate the black knight. In fact, black will suffer from the lack of support along d file. After c4, black played knight e7, and this is generally an improvement for the knight comparing to its position on b6, bishop e3, and c5. And here we see that not only is the bishop on e3 limited, so there is already some hope for the knight, because knights are better in closed positions, but also black is ready to transfer the knight to a very good position, and as I said, the knights are better than the bishops when they have clear support. So the knight may be heading towards d4, and this can be achieved via either c6 or f5. Here, even though I said Karpov was not so superior to his opponent, Ljubojevich made a horrific strategical mistake in this position, because it's quite well known, at least I think so, and at least it should be quite well known, that bishops are better than the knights in the positions with pawns on both parts of the board, but the situation changes once there is a queen plus bishop versus queen and the knight situation. In such situations, when there is a queen versus knight and a queen versus bishop, a queen and the knight is stronger. So we already see that even though the pawns are placed on both parts of the board, black already managed to find a nice square for the knight. The position is closed, and here after rook d8, rook d8, rook d1, black is already better, because the only pieces that are left on the board are queen versus knight and the queen versus bishop. And the way Karpov converted, we could already say, converted his strategical advantage is absolutely outstanding, and I'm going to show you the rest of the game. It may be a little bit longish, so I may avoid commenting on each and every move and show you the alternatives, so please forgive me. But the course of the game is pretty much an exemplary way of play, so I'm pretty sure you will not regret taking a look. So b6 to support c5, queen d3, and here Karpov played g6, which is an extremely strong move. Black just wants to trade h for the f pawn, and then play h5, establish the blockade on light squares, put the knight on f5, and just enjoy the knight on an outpost. So of course g4 is not any better, because black just takes knight f5. The knight cannot be driven away, so black's advantage is beyond any doubt. There was h takes g6, f takes g6, a3, queen e4 was better, just to mention, a3, a5, b3, h5. Now f5 square is supported, and black is ready to jump on f5 with the knight. Queen e4, knight f5, bishop f2. It was already probably necessary to avoid exchanging the queens, because queen b7 was the move that Karpov could at least consider, as the difference between the knight and the bishop is really huge here, and actually if there is a piece that white should keep, it's the queen, because the queen on e4 is very strong, but very active, and the queen on c7 does not look as as strong as the white queen. There was bishop f2, queen d7, and a4. This is of course another very bad decision, because now Ljubojevich is deprived from any sort of active plan. He will never have the possibility of breaking through with b4. So closing the position even further and hoping for creating some sort of a fortress is basically not realistic. King c7, king towards the center, king c2. Okay, I should probably mention that queen a8 was very inaccurate due to queen d3. After queen a7, king c8, it seems that the black king simply escapes to the king side, and queen b6 is never possible due to queen f1, and also the simple threat of queen takes b3 simply decides the game. So black more or less forced white to play a move like king c2, and here queen d8. Now black controls all of the squares that white could use to penetrate, and the queen is transferred in such a way that now it prepares the g5 break. King c1, g5, f takes, queen takes, king c2, knight e7. Now the knight is transferred back to c6. In case of queen a8, there's once again going to be no, not knight c6, sorry. Queen f5 actually just forks the king and the bishop. Queen h7, king d7, queen e4, and queen f5. It's quite obvious that the knight versus bishop endgame is going to be winning. Queen d3, king c6. Of course, Karpov doesn't want to trade off the queens on d3. He just waits for queen takes f5, because now instead of knight takes f5, e takes f5, creating the e6 square for the king, and white will have great difficulties with protecting his e5 pawn. Bishop e3, knight g6, e6, king d6, bishop g5, king e6. Here, if bishop d8, then black just breaks through with f4, g takes f4, h4, and there is no time to capture on b6. So instead, white just went king d2, f4 once again, g takes, h4. This is a mistake, but as it turns out, this also wins. The simpler was just king f5, and black can first collect on f4, and in case of king e3 he can play h4, which seems to be winning. After g takes, there was h4, king e3, h3, king f3, king f5, king g3, knight takes f4, of course bishop takes f4 just loses to h2, king f4, and black will be the first to grab the pawns on queen side, so bishop d8, and here a very good transfer of the knight, knight e2, king h3, knight d4, bishop b6, knight b3, both of the pawns are protected, and now since the black king is more active, black is just winning the pawns on queen side and winning the game as a result. So bishop d8, king e4, king g4, king d3, king f4, take, king c3, bishop f6, king c2. It's just a matter of time, so bishop e5, c4, king e3, c3, the pawn is just unstoppable. Bishop f6, now knight c5, the a4 pawn is also going to be won. King e2, king b3, and Ljubojevich resigned. When you look at a game like this, it's basically Capablanca's statement that starts to make sense. I mean, it's really about knowing which piece to place on which square and which pieces to exchange. Here, Karpov didn't really make anything so impressive. He didn't make a single mistake. He knew that if Ljubojevich is going to play too ambitiously and too actively, he's going to leave himself with a bad bishop. And Karpov, of course. Karpov took advantage of that by just letting himself play with a knight versus bishop. Then Ljubojevich made probably the decisive mistake which was connected with exchanging the pair of rooks. As I said, queen versus knight, queen plus knight is better than queen plus knight is better than queen plus bishop. And since the position was quite closed and the knight that Karpov had a very clear outpost and a point of support, it was just about converting this sort of positional advantage. And when it comes down to players like Karpov, for them it's just a piece of cake, and Karpov proved it. The beauty is in simplicity. I'm going to repeat that once again, and I hope you enjoyed this game as much as I do. And please stay tuned. There's going to be a few more games played by world champions, among other strong players. This has been Mateusz Kołosowski for Mind Sports Academy.